On the morning of October 13th, 1841, Hartford High Society gathered at Trinity Episcopal Church for what was expected to be a flawless wedding, only to witness one of the city's most infamous tragedies. 19-year-old Bridget O'Sullivan had just raised her ceremonial glass of wine when she suddenly collapsed, her white gown spreading across the altar floor as she convulsed and gasped for air. Witnesses heard her last desperate words. The wine had burned before she fell still. Within 3 days, investigators confirmed what many already suspected: this was no accident. Bridget had been poisoned, and the person responsible was not some shadowy outsider, but a guest calmly seated among the congregation, watching their plan unfold with chilling patience. The scandal shocked Connecticut, but the deeper story revealed more than a single act of murder. It exposed the bitter divides in Hartford, a city caught between old New England traditions and the forces of industrial progress. By 1841, Hartford had swelled to nearly 13,000 people, with Irish immigrants arriving in large numbers to work in mills and on the railroads. Their presence unsettled the city's established families, who whispered about the Irish problem in parlors and church meetings, fearful of what these newcomers meant for their social order. At the center of Hartford's old guard stood Elena Piton, a widow of formidable wealth and reputation. From her grand Prospect Street mansion with its iron gates and manicured gardens, she embodied the stability and prestige of Connecticut's elite. Elena had married into fortune when she wed Jonathan Piton in 1815, and after his sudden death, she managed their estate with an iron will, ensuring the Piton name retained its influence. Her only son, William, Yale-educated and handsome, was considered one of Hartford's most eligible men. To her, his future, and by extension, her family's legacy, was everything. So when Bridget O'Sullivan, the beautiful Irish immigrant's daughter, entered Hartford society and caught William's attention, it was more than romance. To Elena, it was a threat. Beneath the polished exterior of Hartford's elite world, this marriage represented more than a union between two young people. It symbolized the clash of wealth and poverty, Protestant tradition and Catholic resilience, old money and desperate newcomers. And on that October morning, someone decided that clash could only end in death. Bridget O'Sullivan was striking in every sense, her auburn hair catching light. Even on Hartford's dullest days, her green eyes seeming to hold a brilliance that drew attention wherever she went. When her father Patrick secured steady work as a supervisor at Colt's firearms factory, thanks to his background with machinery in Dublin's mills, it allowed the family to move into a modest but respectable home on Front Street, closer to the city center than most Irish families could ever hope for. Bridget soon found employment as a seamstress in a fashionable dress shop on State Street. Her delicate skill with fine fabrics and her clear, graceful way of speaking free of a heavy Irish brogue made her a favorite among Hartford's wealthier customers. It was during one of Wadsworth Athenaeum's public lecture series that her life first collided with William Piton's. The hall that evening was filled with Hartford's intellectual elite gathered to hear a Harvard professor speak on American literature. Bridget had attended at the urging of her employer, Mrs. Catherine Hendris, who encouraged her Irish staff to seek out culture and self-improvement. William noticed her immediately. She sat quietly in the section reserved for working people, listening with such intensity that she stood out even among the scholars. When the professor invited questions, Bridget's hand rose. Her inquiry about the influence of Irish poetry on American writers was so eloquent that the audience turned to see the young woman bold enough to ask it. Afterward, as she gathered her cloak, William approached with a polite bow. "That was an excellent question about Irish influence," he said. "I'm William Piton." Bridget, her cheeks touched with color, replied steadily, "Bridget O'Sullivan, Mr. Piton. I'm pleased to meet you." They walked together down State Street, discovering a shared love of books and ideas. William was astonished by her knowledge. She had read widely, borrowing volumes from a priest in Dublin and later from Hartford's lending libraries. When they reached the corner where their paths parted, William hesitated before asking if she would join him for the next week's lecture on American history. Bridget's warm smile lit her face. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Peaton." So began a quiet courtship. William, fully aware of the risks to his reputation, was nevertheless drawn to her intelligence and grace. They met for walks along the river, attended cultural gatherings, and found in each other a compatibility that transcended background and class. For nearly 6 months, they kept their growing bond private, unknown. Even to Elela Nina Peton, who assumed her son's frequent absences were business or social obligations. The truth broke through one sweltering afternoon in July of 1840. Elela Nina, intending to surprise William at his office with lemonade and news of a governor's reception, overheard his voice from behind the door, and with it, the unmistakable lilt of an Irish girl. "My mother will never accept this," William said. "But I don't care anymore, Bridget. I love you, and that's what matters." Frozen in place, Eleanor listened as Bridget's soft reply floated through the doorway. "I don't want to be the cause of trouble between you and your mother." William's voice hardened with conviction. "She's controlled my life since Father died. I've never made a decision without her approval, but that ends now. I want you as my bride. She'll see in you what I see." The scrape of a chair jolted Eleanor into retreat. She fled down the stairs, abandoning the lemonade pitcher on the landing. In her carriage back to Prospect Street, her shock curdled into fury. Her son, the heir to the Peaton fortune, intended to marry an Irish girl. Everything she had preserved through sacrifice and ruthless management, her name, her wealth, her place among Hartford's elite, was threatened by this outsider. To Elela Nina, Bridget was not a girl in love, but a schemer who had entrapped her son. By the time the carriage rattled through the gates of the mansion, Eleanor's fear had hardened into something darker. That evening, William returned home in unusually high spirits, humming softly as he carved the roast and smiling with a quiet satisfaction that did not escape his mother's notice. Elela Nina longed to demand answers, to force the truth into the open, but instinct told her to wait. Years of maneuvering within Hartford's unforgiving social circles had taught her the value of patience. She needed certainty before she struck. "You seem very cheerful tonight, William," she said casually. "Do I? Well, perhaps I am. I've been thinking about making some changes in my life. Important ones." He laid his fork down and met her gaze. "Mother, I've met someone, a young woman of rare character and intelligence. I believe she may be the one I wish to marry." Elela Nina's fingers trembled as she lifted her glass. "How wonderful, dear. Anyone I know?" "No, but I want you to meet her soon. Her name is Bridget O'Sullivan. She's from Ireland originally. Her family came here 2 years ago." The glass slipped, shattering against her plate. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she murmured, signaling for the servants. "You said O'Sullivan, an Irish family." "Yes," William said firmly. "Her father works at Colt's factory, and she is employed at Mrs. Hendriss's shop." "Mother, I know what you're thinking." "I'm not thinking anything." William. Eleanor interrupted, her tone measured. "I'm simply surprised. I wanted to be certain of my feelings before telling you." William continued, "But I am certain now. I love her, Mother. I intend to marry her." That night, long after William had gone to bed, Eleanor paced her private sitting room, her mind in turmoil. Marriage to an Irish immigrant would tarnish their name beyond repair. Hartford's best families would shut their doors, and William's children would bear the stigma of mixed heritage outcasts in both worlds. Worse still, an Irish wife would have rights to the Peaton fortune. What if she persuaded William to support her kin, to funnel money toward Catholic parishes, to align himself with the very immigrant causes Hartford's elite viewed with suspicion. Eleanor had not clawed her way from modest merchant stock to the pinnacle of Hartford society only to see everything undone by an outsider. She would not watch the Peaton fortune diverted to Irish relatives and Catholic priests. She would not see her grandchildren kneeling before a pope in Rome. Over the next weeks, she quietly gathered information. Patrick O'Sullivan had a reputation as a diligent worker, but was whispered to be sympathetic to labor unrest. Bridget was well regarded by her employer. Yet society women muttered about the impropriety of an Irish girl acting above her station. The family's devotion to Holy Trinity Catholic Church was to Eleanor the final insult. As summer waned, William grew ever bolder. He escorted Bridget to lectures and gatherings, introducing her with the pride of a man certain of his choice. Eleanor watched from the shadows, her lips set in a thin line as murmurs rippled through Hartford drawing rooms. The breaking point came one September morning when William, over breakfast, announced his intentions. "I've spoken with Mr. O'Sullivan. He has given permission for me to ask for Bridget's hand. I plan to propose this evening." Eleanor set down her cup with deliberate care. "William, I must ask you to reconsider." "Mother, please." "No, let me finish. I've said nothing because I hoped this would fade with time. But marriage is another matter. It is not only about love. It is about compatibility, shared values, and common background. This young woman may be charming, but she comes from a world far removed from ours." William's declaration cut through the air like a blade, his defiance leaving no doubt that his decision was final. Eleanor tried every argument society, children, business, reputation. But William rose from the table, his voice sharp with disappointment. He reminded her that she herself had once married for love. But she countered coldly that her marriage had been one of equal standing, not a reckless union across social divides. When William accused her of prejudice, the mask she wore cracked. It wasn't prejudice, she insisted it was reality. The Irish were not like them, and Bridget would change him in ways he could never undo. But William no longer cared. He was determined to propose that very night, with or without her blessing. After he stormed out, Eleanor sat in the silent dining room, staring at her untouched breakfast. She knew then that persuasion had failed. If William married Bridget O'Sullivan, Eleanor's power, her legacy, and her family's name would all be lost. From that moment on, her thoughts turned not toward reconciliation, but toward prevention. The announcement of the engagement in the Hartford Courant on September 15, 1840, spread like wildfire. A brief notice buried in the society pages sparked a frenzy of gossip across drawing rooms, tea tables, and gentlemen's clubs. Friends offered Eleanor congratulations that felt like mockery, their tones laced with scandal and pity. How progressive of William, they said, their smiles polite but sharp. At a Ladies' Aid Society meeting, Mrs. Harrison Fitzgerald made a pointed remark about maintaining proper standards in marriage. Her eyes fixed on Eleanor as she added, "Of course, charity toward immigrant families is important, but boundaries must never be crossed." Eleanor forced a brittle smile, but humiliation burned inside her like poison. It was not only the social sting, but the spectacle that loomed ahead. The wedding was to be public, a gathering of both families, friends, and the entire city's watchful eyes. Bridget, with her characteristic boldness, refused secrecy. "I want everyone we love to witness our vows," she had told William. "I don't want anyone to think we are ashamed." Eleanor knew this would mean every prominent family in Hartford, even those who despised the match, would attend, if only to see the Irish bride who had ensnared a Peaton. The ceremony would be dissected endlessly. The Peaton name dragged into whispered ridicule for years to come. Her strategy shifted. She began to watch Bridget with the intensity of a general studying an enemy. At lectures, at gatherings, in shops, Eleanor observed the girl closely. To her dismay, Bridget was not the unpolished peasant she had hoped to expose. She was graceful, intelligent, warm, a young woman who carried herself with a natural elegance that no finishing school could teach. Even Eleanor's harshest critics conceded that Bridget had a poise unusual for her background. Worse, William's devotion was absolute. He looked at her with a tenderness Eleanor had never seen in him before, listened to her with undivided attention, and defended her against slights with the same fire his father had once shown in protecting Eleanor herself. By early October, desperation consumed her. She turned over possibilities in the long hours of the night. Feigning illness might only delay the inevitable. Bribing Patrick O'Sullivan risked public disgrace if exposed. Threatening William with disinheritance could drive him further away, cutting off the last threads of influence she held. None of these plans gave her what she needed: certainty. She wanted a solution that was final, absolute, and unassailable. Then one sleepless night, as the autumn wind rattled the shutters of Prospect Street, the answer revealed itself. A single ruthless course of action that would silence scandal forever. Late one night, as Eleanor sifted through Jonathan's old business papers in search of some legal means to preserve her control over the estate, she stumbled upon a revelation more powerful than any contract. Buried among correspondence from a New York associate were detailed notes on chemicals used in manufacturing. One letter in particular caught her attention. It discussed arsenic oxide, a white crystalline powder once considered for use in fabric treatments. Jonathan had dismissed the idea as too dangerous, but the associate had outlined its properties with clinical precision. It dissolved easily into liquids, carried little to no taste when masked by stronger flavors, and brought on symptoms that mimicked common illnesses. Most importantly, it was nearly impossible to detect without advanced analysis that few physicians could perform. Eleanor read the passage again and again, her pulse quickening as a new possibility took shape. Here was a solution to the problem of Bridget O'Sullivan, clean, swift, and cloaked in plausibility. A young bride fainting at the altar, overcome by nerves or by a sudden illness, was not unheard of. But this fainting spell would end in tragedy. The Peaton fortune and name would remain secure, while society would speak only of misfortune, not disgrace. Within days, the plan hardened into resolve. On October 8th, just 5 days before the wedding, Eleanor boarded a train bound for New York. She dressed in her most refined traveling clothes and carried Jonathan's old correspondence as proof of her purpose. At the offices of Hartwell Chemical Supply, she presented herself as a widow, tying up her husband's unfinished affairs. The proprietor, Mr. Hartwell, a nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles, remembered Jonathan as cautious and meticulous. Eleanor spoke smoothly of textile preservation, quoting directly from the letters she had studied until the terms rolled off her tongue. Yes, arsenic oxide, Hartwell confirmed after consulting his ledger. Your husband expressed interest, though he wisely hesitated. Dangerous compound, this, but very effective in the right context. He disappeared briefly into his storeroom and returned with a small glass vial no larger than his palm, filled with a fine white powder. 2 ounces, enough for your experiments. Handle with extreme care. It is lethal if inhaled or swallowed. Eleanor paid in cash, slipping the vial into her reticule with steady hands. On the train back to Hartford, she clutched her purse close, keenly aware of the silent weapon it now contained. Yet she felt no guilt, no hesitation, only a grim sense of triumph. She had acted decisively, as a Peaton must. Whatever else history might say of her, it would never say she allowed her family's name to fall into ruin. In the final days before the wedding, Hartford buzzed with anticipation, while within the Peaton household, every moment carried a double edge. Bridget, with her open heart and determined optimism invited Eleanor into the planning of the reception, as though unity could be built on gestures of kindness. "I want this to feel like your celebration too," Mrs. Peyton, she had said sweetly while reviewing menus. "William speaks of you with such love. I hope in time you might feel the same toward me." Eleanor's smile never wavered, though behind it, her mind worked like a clockwork mechanism. She had already calculated precisely how much arsenic oxide would guarantee an outcome, swift yet natural in appearance, half a teaspoon carefully dissolved into wine. Not enough to draw suspicion, not so much as to betray its presence. It would look like faintness or a heart giving out under the strain of excitement. On the morning of October 13th, Eleanor rose before the sun with a calm clarity that felt almost like relief. She had rehearsed every motion in her mind 100 times, and now the hour of execution had arrived. The plan was simple, elegant, impossible to trace. She dressed deliberately in her dark blue silk gown, the same shade she had worn at her own wedding fastening at her throat, the pearl necklace Jonathan had once clasped there. Her mirror reflected a picture of dignified composure, a matron of Hartford society ready to witness her son's union. Nothing in her expression betrayed the vial of death hidden in the silk sachet stitched into her pocket. By 9 o'clock, she was at Trinity Episcopal Church, moving with quiet efficiency as she oversaw the final details. The Gothic spire rose against a pale autumn sky, the sanctuary adorned with modest bouquets of golden chrysanthemums and burgundy ribbons. Bridget's means had been limited, but the effect was tasteful, even admirable, a fact that galled Eleanor more than she cared to admit. Father Matthews, gray-haired and gentle, welcomed her warmly. "Mrs. Peyton, how wonderful to see you. I hear you've been invaluable in arranging the celebration." Eleanor inclined her head gracefully. "It is my pleasure, Father. This is a day of great joy for our family." She drifted through the space, her gaze returning always to the communion table. There, gleaming in the filtered light of stained glass, stood the heavy silver chalice she herself had gifted the couple waiting to hold the consecrated wine. The bottle of French vintage she had insisted upon rested in the vestry set aside at her personal request. To all appearances, it was a mother's thoughtful gesture to mark the beginning of her son's marriage with only the finest. To Eleanor, it was the vessel of salvation. The Peyton name would not be dragged into ruin. By 10:30, the first guests arrived, filling the church with polite chatter, rustling silk, and the faint scent of perfume. Eleanor moved among them with serene poise, offering gracious words of welcome, while her hand brushed now and again against the pocket where the sachet lay hidden. Each touch was a reassurance. She was ready. Eleanor positioned herself at the entrance of Trinity Episcopal with the precision of a hostess and the poise of a general on campaign. She greeted Hartford's elite with flawless courtesy, watching their carefully measured responses as they filed past Irish laborers and their families. There were nods of politeness, half smiles that never touched the eyes, and an almost imperceptible drawing back of shoulders, a subtle dance of distance that confirmed Eleanor's every expectation. And then Patrick O'Sullivan entered proudly, guiding his younger children to their seats. His suit was new. His shoes polished, his pride unmistakable. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten. How dare he walk into her world as though he belonged there? At 10:45, William arrived accompanied by his best man. Eleanor's heart softened as she saw her son adjusting his cravat, nervous but radiant, speaking earnestly to Father Matthews. For a moment her resolve faltered. He looked so young, so alive, so utterly unprepared for the life he was about to throw away. She told herself that what she was about to do was not cruelty, it was mercy, the only way to preserve everything Jonathan had built. When the bells struck the hour, the church turned as one. Bridget appeared arm in arm with her father, her auburn hair shining beneath the pale light of stained glass. Her gown, simple but exquisitely sewn by her own hand, fit her like destiny itself. The bouquet of white roses trembled only slightly in her grasp, and her face glowed with such happiness that even the hardest hearts in the pews seemed to soften. Eleanor felt the breath catch in her throat despite herself. The girl was beautiful, and worse, she was dignified. Even Hartford's most rigid matrons allowed themselves small smiles at the sight. The ceremony unfolded with solemn grace. Father Matthews spoke of covenant and fidelity, of respect and the shared burdens of life. William and Bridget exchanged vows with voices clear and steady. Their eyes locked as though no one else in the church existed. Eleanor sat in the front pew, her gloved hand resting lightly over the hidden sachet in her dress. Soon, she told herself. Very soon. When the time came for the blessing of the wine, Eleanor rose smoothly, her face serene. "Allow me to assist, Father," she murmured, stepping toward the communion table. The heavy silver chalice gleamed on the altar, its dark contents waiting. As the priest addressed the congregation, Eleanor's fingers moved with practiced ease. She withdrew the sachet, tipped the white powder into the wine, and stirred gently with the silver spoon. The crystals vanished instantly, leaving nothing but the ruby sheen of celebration. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding her face a mask of composure. Father Matthews lifted the chalice high. "William and Bridget, come forward and share the wine of commitment, the symbol of your life together." William sipped first, then passed the cup with a smile to his bride. Bridget accepted with both hands, her eyes shining, and drank deeply. Eleanor's pulse thudded in her ears as she watched the girl lower the cup, smiling still utterly unsuspecting. The vows complete. The guests applauded warmly as the couple turned to walk back down the aisle. Eleanor joined the receiving line, nodding and smiling with mechanical precision, but her gaze never left Bridget. Any moment now, the signs would come: paleness, shortness of breath, a hand pressed to her stomach. She had studied every description, memorized every symptom. 15 minutes, perhaps 20. Certainly no more than 30. Yet, as the line of well-wishers wound through the church, Bridget remained vibrant and alive. She laughed easily at her new husband's whispered remarks, her cheeks glowing with color, her step light and graceful. With each passing moment, Eleanor's certainty began to fray. The poison was inside her. Eleanor knew it. So why then did Bridget O'Sullivan look like the very embodiment of life? For nearly an hour, Eleanor's nerves frayed with every heartbeat. Bridget had taken the poisoned chalice in full view of Hartford society, and yet she showed no sign of weakness. Her cheeks remained flushed with vitality, her laughter rang clear across the Peaton Mansion's drawing room, and she moved with the confidence of a woman newly secure in her place among Hartford's elite. Each passing minute sharpened Eleanor's dread. Had she misread Jonathan's correspondence? Had the dosage been too little, or the compound corrupted in transit, or most unbearable of all? Was Bridget simply too strong, her Irish constitution defying even poison? The reception unfurled around her in a haze of music, champagne, and polite chatter. Eleanor moved from guest to guest with flawless poise, though inside she was unraveling. The irony stung while others whispered their grudging admiration of Bridget's refinement. Eleanor alone knew how close she had come to erasing the girl from existence. Now she was left choking on compliments that felt like barbs. "Yes, Bridget is a lovely girl," she replied with mechanical sweetness, even as bile rose in her throat. If this failure held, the O'Sullivans would be tied to the Peaton name forever, and Eleanor's empire of reputation would collapse into scandal and ridicule. She withdrew to her study under the guise of fatigue, pacing furiously across the Persian carpet. The vial was empty, her chance spent. Her plan, her perfect plan, had failed. Panic gave way to desperation as she considered wild alternatives: a sudden illness staged to delay the wedding trip, a private confrontation, even open disinheritance. None offered the certainty she craved. Then, just as despair began to consume her, a sudden disturbance echoed through the house. Voices called out in alarm, chairs scraped hastily against the floor, and the name Dr. Harrison rang through the din. Eleanor froze mid-step, her breath catching as hope flared anew. Perhaps the poison had not failed after all. Perhaps it had only chosen this moment here in the heart of her mansion to reveal its dreadful work. Eleanor slipped seamlessly into the role of the concerned matron, her face composed into lines of sympathy even as triumph hummed beneath her skin. But the scene before her was even more dramatic than she had dared imagine. Bridget sat slumped in Eleanor's finest chair, her radiant glow gone, her complexion ashen. William was kneeling at her side, his hand clasping hers, his face drawn with terror. The girl's breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts, her free hand pressed to her stomach as she whispered, "I don't understand." I felt fine, and then suddenly, Dr. Harrison bent over her with brisk efficiency, his lined face grim as he checked her pulse and questioned her between gasps. Stomach pain, burning in the throat. "Yes," William answered quickly, his voice strained. "She says it feels as though her throat is on fire." Eleanor hovered nearby, her voice soft, tinged with perfect imitation of alarm. "Dr. Harrison, is there nothing we can do? Should we not move her upstairs?" "Not yet." The physician replied, sharp and authoritative. "Send for my medical bag at once, and have the cook prepare salt water she must drink as much as she can." Servants scattered to obey, skirts rustling, boots thudding down the hall, as Eleanor watched her victory seemed almost assured. Bridget's breathing grew ragged, perspiration beading across her brow. Her hands trembled violently against the carved wood of the chair. Then, with an effort that seemed to pull from her very soul, Bridget whispered, "The wine." It burned. For one terrible instant, Eleanor thought the girl's eyes were fixed directly upon her, bright with accusation. Ice sluiced through her veins. Had Bridget understood, or were these simply the delirious mutterings of a poisoned mind? "The wine," Eleanor asked, smoothly, steady as stone. "Why, my dear, it was our finest French vintage. Surely you're only overcome by the excitement of the day." But Dr. Harrison had stilled at the words. His head lifted sharply, his gaze sweeping from bride to matron and back again. His tone when he spoke was clipped and deadly serious. "Mrs. Peyton, what wine exactly was used for the ceremony?" Eleanor's smile froze in place. "French vintage from our private cellar. A bottle we've served for years at family celebrations." "Doctor, surely you don't imagine—" "I imagine," Harrison interrupted, his voice ringing with conviction, "that we are dealing with more than simple nerves. I believe we are looking at deliberate poisoning." The words struck the drawing room like a hammer blow. A hush fell across the assembled guests, broken only by sharp intakes of breath and the shuffle of men edging nearer to catch every word. Several women gasped, pressing handkerchiefs to their mouths. William's face drained of blood. "Poison," he repeated, horrified. "That's impossible. Bridget hasn't taken anything I haven't tasted myself." "Not true," Dr. Harrison countered, his tone grim. "Only the bride and groom shared from the chalice. You, sir, appear well. Your bride does not. That distinction cannot be ignored." Eleanor felt the panic rise hot and choking in her throat. The walls seemed to close in around her as Harrison narrowed the field of suspicion with each word. He was drawing a line straight to the silver chalice, straight to the moment she had thought so perfectly planned. If he retrieved it, if he tested it, her careful edifice would collapse in an instant. Eleanor felt the ground slipping beneath her. Each word from Dr. Harrison was like a nail hammered into the coffin of her perfect plan. She had hoped for a tragedy wrapped in mystery, something that would draw sympathy, not suspicion. Instead, the doctor's calm authority stripped away every convenient explanation. Bridget, barely clinging to consciousness, gave no relief. Her pallor was now ghostly, her breathing shallow, every rasped whisper a reminder that she might yet live long enough to speak aloud what Eleanor had prayed would remain forever hidden. Across the room, William hovered frantic and pale-torn between terror for his wife and disbelief at the suggestion of deliberate harm. When Harrison's assistant returned with the chalice and bottle, Eleanor's pulse surged wildly. She had not known such tests were possible, had not imagined science might betray her so thoroughly. Watching the physician perform his examinations, she tried to mask her dread with maternal concern, but her palms were damp and her throat felt raw. As I suspected, Harrison said at last, his voice heavy with certainty, "The chalice contains unmistakable traces of arsenic. The wine, too. This was no accident. This was deliberate." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. William recoiled as if struck. Murder, but Bridget, she has no enemies who would want to harm her? That was the question Eleanor had most dreaded. The doctor's gaze swept the room slowly, methodically, before settling on her. It was not accusation, not yet, but it was scrutiny sharper than any knife. Eleanor's skin prickled under the weight of it. Forcing her tone into a calm, reasonable register, she said, "Surely, doctor, it could have been anyone. The church is open, the staff coming and going. Members of the wedding party, even strangers, any one of them could have tampered with the wine." Harrison did not argue outright, but his expression told her she had gained nothing. His reply was quiet, steady, and merciless. "Perhaps. But arsenic oxide is not a substance one stumbles upon. To obtain it requires knowledge, resources, and intent. This was not the act of some passing mischief maker. Whoever poisoned that chalice knew precisely what they were doing." The silence that followed pressed in like a physical weight. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing for a path of escape. Yet in the eyes of Hartford's most trusted physician, she saw something that terrified her far more than discovery. She saw certainty forming piece by piece, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth was spoken aloud. The room seemed to shrink around them as Bridget's trembling words echoed like a death knell. The poisoner was no longer some faceless phantom lurking in the shadows. It was Eleanor Peaton herself, Hartford's most formidable matron, unmasked by the very girl she had sought to erase. William's face, pale with shock, was almost unrecognizable to her, his dark eyes wide and hollow as if staring at a stranger. "Mother," he whispered, each syllable brittle with pain. "Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't try to murder my wife." For a moment, Eleanor thought of denying it, of clinging to the remnants of her dignity. But what point was there Bridget had seen her? Dr. Harrison had the chalice. The eyes of Hartford's most trusted witnesses were upon her. The truth, long hidden behind masks of grace and control, surged to the surface like floodwaters breaking through a dam. "Yes," she said at last, her voice startlingly calm. "I did it." She would have destroyed everything. Gasps rippled through the room, and William staggered back as though struck. Eleanor's eyes flashed with a mixture of sorrow and stubborn pride. "Our family's name, our fortune, our place among Hartford's best, we have preserved it for generations. And you would throw it away for her? An Irish girl who bewitched you with her charm. I could not allow it." William's face contorted with anguish, his hand tightening around Bridget's. "You tried to kill the woman I love because of where she was born, because of her faith." "I tried to save you," Eleanor retorted, her voice rising with desperate conviction. "Save you from a life of disgrace, from children branded as outcasts, from seeing everything your father built sink into the mud of immigrant poverty and Catholic superstition." William's voice broke as he pointed toward Bridget, pale but alive, on the table. "Those outcasts you speak of, would have been your grandchildren, Mother. Flesh of your flesh, and you would rather kill them than risk their birth. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Dr. Harrison's lined face was set in grim resolve. The guests who had crowded into the office shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet Eleanor's eyes. And Eleanor herself, once the unshakable matriarch of Hartford society, stood revealed not as a protector of legacy, but as a would-be murderer undone by her own hand. The words Eleanor spat in her defense, half-Irish mongrels, polluted blood alien traditions, hung in the air like poison, heavier than the arsenic she had poured into the chalice. Whatever sympathy her station or reputation might once have afforded her, evaporated in that moment. Dr. Harrison, steady and unshaken, stepped forward. "Mrs. Peaton, I will notify the constabulary at once. You have confessed before witnesses to an act of attempted murder. The law is clear." Eleanor laughed bitterly, clinging to her arrogance. "Do you truly believe Hartford will punish one of its own? Half the men in council chambers share my concerns about the Irish. They'll thank me for protecting my family." Harrison's gaze hardened. "Perhaps they share your concerns, Mrs. Peaton, but they also share the law. Poisoning is no matter of opinion. The law applies to you as it applies to anyone else." The trial that followed was unlike anything Hartford had seen. On November 20th, 1841, the city's Superior Court was filled beyond capacity, while newspapers from Boston to New York devoted daily columns to every revelation. The spectacle of Eleanor Peaton, a widow of stature and wealth, standing accused of poisoning her son's bride, was irresistible to a public already divided over the influx of Irish immigrants. The case became more than a prosecution. It was a mirror held to society's anxieties. Judge Samuel Huntington, though personally acquainted with Eleanor and sympathetic to her social fears, ruled with strict adherence to law. The evidence against her was devastating, the chemical analysis confirming arsenic in the chalice, Dr. Harrison's unshakable testimony, Bridget's vivid account of seeing Eleanor tampering with the wine, and Eleanor's own words spoken in desperation in the doctor's office. District Attorney Charles Morgan presented her as the embodiment of prejudice turned murderess, a woman who elevated vanity and social ambition above human life. Eleanor's lawyer countered by framing her actions as the madness of a mother undone by emotional distress. But the jury saw through it. The measured purchase of arsenic, the precision of her preparations, and the timing of her crime painted a portrait not of madness, but of cold calculation. When Bridget took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. Pale but composed, she recounted her wedding day with quiet dignity. Her intelligence and refinement undermined Eleanor's depiction of her as a crude foreigner. "I hold no hatred for Mrs. Peaton," Bridget told the jury, her voice steady. "I believe she acted out of love for her son. But I cannot forget that she tried to kill me because of where I was born." William's testimony was shattering. Torn between loyalty to his mother and devotion to his wife, he spoke with tears in his eyes. "My mother taught me honor and moral courage," he said. "Those values now require that I speak truthfully no matter the cost." The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty of attempted murder. Judge Huntington, while acknowledging Eleanor's reputation and former standing, imposed a sentence of 15 years in Connecticut State Prison. This crime, he declared, strikes at the heart of civilized society. When prejudice and social ambition drive one to attempted murder, the law must answer with severity. No citizen, no matter their wealth or lineage, stands above justice. Eleanor Peaton left the courtroom that day, not as Hartford's most formidable matron, but as a convicted criminal, her legacy forever entwined with the scandal that had begun at a wedding altar. Eleanor listened to her sentence without a flicker of emotion, her face as still as marble. To onlookers, it seemed she had wrapped herself in the same cold dignity that had defined her life. But those who paid closer attention noticed she never once turned toward William or Bridget as the court officers led her away. Hartford society, scandalized and fascinated, wasted no time in closing its doors to the Peaton family. Whatever respect the name had commanded evaporated in the shadow of the trial. William and Bridget soon left Hartford behind. In Boston, William built a strong law practice, his intellect and determination carving out a reputation that Hartford had denied him. Bridget thrived as well, raising 3 children and dedicating herself to charitable causes that aided Irish immigrants. Where Eleanor had seen only corruption and danger, Bridget built bridges of compassion, earning admiration as a woman of grace and quiet influence. Eleanor, meanwhile, endured 12 years in prison before being released for good behavior in 1853. By then, she was no longer the formidable matriarch of Hartford, but a diminished figure living in a boarding house, her fortune exhausted, her legacy stained. She died in 1858, estranged from her son, and denied the chance to know her grandchildren. The chalice that had carried death was melted down by Trinity Church, its silver repurposed for a fund supporting the very immigrants Eleanor had sought to keep out of her family. Father Matthews, haunted by the violation of sacred ritual, introduced new safeguards to ensure no ceremonial vessel could ever again be tampered with in private. The poison chalice case, as newspapers named it, reverberated far beyond Hartford. Scholars pointed to it as a milestone in forensic investigation, thanks to Dr. Harrison's testimony and chemical analysis. Ministers and civic leaders cited it as a moral parable against prejudice. Parents whispered it to their children as a warning: unchecked hatred destroys not only its target, but the hand that wields it. In 1865, more than 2 decades later, William returned to Hartford with Bridget and their children. They came not to relive scandal, but to honor Jonathan Peaton's memory at his graveside. Townspeople who had once whispered about the Irish bride and the ruined Peaton name now saw instead a thriving family respected in Boston, admired for their resilience, and united by a bond stronger than the venom that had nearly ended it. Bridget Gray, now softening her auburn hair, stood quietly at the headstone. She had never spoken publicly of forgiveness, but those who watched her kneel in prayer sensed a peace that Eleanor herself had never found. The Hartford Courant marked the family's visit with a single paragraph, closing with an irony no fiction writer could improve upon. The marriage that prejudice sought to destroy has instead flourished into one of New England's most honored families. Proof that love and character triumph over hatred and fear. This story reminds us how easily fear and prejudice can twist even the most respectable lives into ruin, and how courage, dignity, and compassion can outlast scandal, hatred, and even attempted murder.